So far in this series, we've managed to walk through the main structure of the book of Philippians. We've seen that Paul's primary focus in this letter is exploring the dynamic and importance of Christian unity as we strive side by side for the sake of the gospel. We've seen that Paul recognizes that this aspect of our lives is a piece of a larger pursuit to use our lives to retell the story of Jesus. And that in order for this to happen, Christian unity must be achieved in a way that follows the pattern Jesus set out for us, namely by responding to conflict, both internal and external, with humility and allowing the unity that comes out of this humility to result in the gospel of Jesus being proclaimed. In this video, we're going to look at three other important themes that flow through Paul's letter. Each of these are topics that naturally emerge out of the themes that Paul is discussing, but are all deserving of their own individual analysis because of the part they play in Paul's discourse. So one at a time, we're going to look at joy, sacrifice, and thanksgiving. See what Paul has to say about each, and notice how they align with the overall structure of the book of Philippians. The theme of joy in Philippians is an interesting one. Joy is, of course, the opposite of the natural reaction to having been thrown in prison. But as Paul writes his letter, he describes his experience with the word joy or rejoice 6 times. And he also uses these words 6 more times, not describing his own experience, but rather the experience of his readers. So this is a theme that matches Paul's repeated pattern in this letter, which is to use someone as an example of an idea, and then ask the Philippians to learn from that example. And specifically, when he uses Jesus or himself as the example, he calls the Philippians to imitate it. Unity or partnership is the central theme of Philippians. So as we trace the thread of joy throughout the book, we'll find that the majority of times that Paul talks about joy are in reference to unity. 5 of the 6 times Paul talks about his own joy, he's primarily referring to how he feels about his relationship with the believers in Philippi. And 4 of the 6 times he talks about their joy, he's referring to a gospel partnership relationship that they're involved in. Just this overview of how Paul mentions Christian joy in his letter is enough to make us realize we're not supposed to pursue joy in Jesus on our own. The community in our churches was designed by God on purpose. We need those relationships as we aim for greater experiences of joy in God. While the theme of Christian relationship is where there is the greatest saturation of Paul's discussion of joy, it does come up while he writes in his other themes as well. In verse 18 of chapter 1, Paul mentions how he is rejoicing in the midst of his conflict, even because of his conflict, because it is resulting in the advance of the gospel. In chapter 2, when Paul says that his joy is made complete by his Philippian partner's way of life, the way of life he's referring to is that of humility. In chapter 3, while Paul is describing what it means to rejoice in the Lord, his entire thought process is wrapped up in the foundational principle of the gospel, abandoning the pursuit of self-justification and finding the free gift of reconciliation with God in Jesus Christ. And he then describes how that works in the midst of conflict in chapter 4. Recognizing the greatness of his worth and the gift that we've been given, we bring all our anxieties to God in thankful prayer. It's clear that Paul is communicating that joy is extremely important. In fact, what he's saying is that joy is essential in the process of living out the life of Jesus in the midst of conflict, in order to react with humility, create unity, and spread the gospel. The theme of sacrifice is important to include when studying this letter because Paul brings it up more than once. It ties in to the other themes he's talking about, and what he has to say about sacrifice is very surprising and very helpful. It starts in chapter 1 where Paul says that he's rejoicing that his freedom has been taken away because the gospel is flourishing as a result. So Paul is making the sacrifice of being in prison, and he's doing it happily because it results in the advance of the gospel. In chapter 2, Paul brings out the nature of sacrifice as it relates to the theme of humility. When we looked at Paul's idea of humility, we saw that it's all about giving up the things we want in order to pursue what is best for others. The sacrifice of our own desires is of course at the core of this idea. In verses 1 through 11 of chapter 2, Paul is calling the Philippians to follow the example of Jesus, who embodied this humility in his own sacrifice on the cross. Paul is saying that this is like a template for the way that we use our own lives as a sacrifice of humility. Then his account of Epaphroditus' illness lines up with this. This is a man who confronted death in order to serve others, and in the midst of doing so, was more concerned about their well-being than his own life. The relationship between sacrifice and unity is spread all over the book. In chapter 1, Paul contemplates the possibility that this imprisonment will be the end of his life. Although he wants to continue on living and working for the benefit of his partners in the gospel, he would rather finish his life and be with Christ. This is a fantastic twist because it isn't the risk of death that Paul is considering the sacrifice. It's continuing to live. So here's the upside-down nature of following Jesus. Death is victory, and our lives are sacrifices to God. Paul carries on this idea in chapter 2 when he uses the picture of ritual sacrifice to define the relationship between his life and the continued faith and ministry of the Philippians. He says his life is a drink offering to be poured out on the sacrificial offering of their faith. The idea Paul is communicating is one of humility, that the Philippians' faith and ministry is more significant than Paul's own, and one of partnership, that Paul's working has its purpose in facilitating and supporting his readers because his life is a sacrifice. The idea is drawn on further in chapter 4 as Paul turns his attention to the gift of the Philippian church. He says their gift is also like a sacrificial offering that pleases God. Another way that Paul talks about sacrifice is in chapter 3. He discusses how he'd given up all of the religious achievements he'd gained in his past life. He says he did this so that he could instead gain the righteousness from God that comes through Christ. So here Paul shows how sacrificing ourselves is key to understanding the gospel, because being united with Christ means dying with him, so that we can also be raised with him to our new lives. A process that Paul says he lives out every day. And here we see again a surprising twist, because to us, the idea of sacrifice is usually giving something up and getting nothing in return. Paul wants to redefine how we think of giving our lives as sacrifices. The whole idea of chapter 3 is that Paul gained in Jesus something infinitely more valuable than what he gave up. So here's what the book of Philippians teaches us about sacrifice. Everything we could ever give up in order to gain more of Jesus is not really a sacrifice. What it is a good trade. Thankfulness is a theme that comes up in Paul's letter less often than these others that we've looked at. However, it is a very important theme to recognize because Philippians, after all, is a thank you letter. The theme of thankfulness is tied closely to the theme of joy, as the two sentiments are very similar to each other. So when we approach the theme of thankfulness here, we could include all of Paul's discussion of joy and rejoicing, and how those things are significant in our lives as we live out the life of Jesus. But really, the theme of thankfulness is just a way of looking at a specific piece of Paul's teaching on joy. It's actually the very first thing he says when he begins the letter in chapter 1, verse 3. He tells the Philippians that he thanks God every time he remembers them in prayer. As he goes on to describe how joyful he is that they've partnered with him in his ministry of the gospel, the whole paragraph is colored by this idea of thankfulness. While the idea of thankfulness runs underneath the whole letter, it comes up again in focus at the end. In chapter 4, Paul tells the Philippians that as they experience the conflict of living as citizens of heaven in a patriotically Roman culture and manage their way through life, sometimes without the basic things they need, they should not be anxious. And the way they avoid this anxiety is by coming to God in prayer with thanksgiving. Being thankful for what we have is often the best way to deal with not having everything we want. Once again, Paul is going to use himself as an example here. In verses 10 through 20, he will finally get around to thanking the Philippians for their generous gift. As he does this, he makes the point that while he is thankful for the Philippians and their partnership, he's rejoicing that they will receive credit for their generosity, and he's glad to have the gift they sent. He actually is perfectly happy to do without when he has to. He says he is content in all things, demonstrating the peace that comes through knowing Jesus. Thanksgiving is possible even when we have very little. This understanding of what Paul says about thankfulness actually provides a helpful insight into Paul's topic of joy, because it's kind of like a doorway. Thanking God for things doesn't bring about joy in the Lord all on its own, and thanking God isn't the only way to find joy in the Lord, but Paul does present it like an open door into the joy of the Lord, which, if you think about it, makes a lot of sense. If we're going to rejoice in all the things God has done for us and all the things He's given to us, it will always involve being thankful for those things. So how do you go about stirring up your joy in the Lord? Start thanking Him for what He's done for you. So here's the message of the book of Philippians. If you are a follower of Jesus, you are called by God to do with your life what Jesus did with His. You can do this by responding to the conflict and difficulty you face with the humility of Jesus. This will allow you to forge Christ-exalting Christian partnerships that shine the light of the gospel into the world around you. Joy is essential, sacrifice is always worth it, and a good place to start is thanking God for what you've been given in Jesus Christ.